Yo, what's up guys? Alf here, and today I'm going to be doing a full in-depth deck breakdown of a deck that managed to get top 8 in yesterday's Arena Championship 4 in the hands of Brian Heaney. So this is a deck that I built and then worked on an absolute bunch with Brian in preparation for this event, and I'm really happy with how the deck came together. I feel like we ended up on a really tuned list. I felt like we had really solid game plans for all of the matchups that we expected as well, and the deck did perform really well. Brian managed to go 5-1 in the Historic constructed rounds and was second place going into the Swiss, going into top 8 after Swiss, which is a really sick achievement. So big congrats to Brian. I thought he played the deck really well. Now unfortunately he did lose in the top 8, but like I said, I think the deck performed really well overall, and I'm really happy with how the deck performed in general. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to explain the deck, explain how it works, go over all the card choices and how we ended up on this exact configuration. I'm going to go over the different matchups, how we planned for them, what our game plan was. I'm going to be briefly speaking to Brian as well about his tournament experience and how he felt the deck performed. And then what I'm going to do after that is just going to, show you some gameplay from the event so you guys can see the deck in action and provide some commentary on that as well. One last thing before I get into it is that I'm also going to be doing a full article about this deck for MTGAzone Premium with a bunch more details, a full sideboard guide, all the prep that we put into this for the tournament, I'm going to be including in that article. So if you're an MTGAzone Premium member, that'll be coming out later this week as well. And there's also going to be a deck list for this deck in the description if you want to check it out and play it yourself. So just want to give a bit of context about how this deck came together. So I originally built the core of this deck a few months ago at this point now, when I was trying out a bunch of different ideas for the Samwise combo alongside Chord of Calling. And back then I came up with the idea of trying to Rope Plane Attendant and Knight Errant Vios to kind of lean the deck a little bit more heavily in the Convoke angle. And the deck was performing incredibly well. I want to give a quick shout out to Omri, because in my initial builds of this deck I was bouncing a lot of different ideas off him, and he was really helpful in the initial builds of the deck. And he also posted his own version of this deck a few weeks ago now, so I'll leave a link to his Twitter down in the description if you want to check that out. But like I said, the deck was performing really, really well. It definitely felt like by far the best version of the Samwise combo that I tried so far, but there were a couple of things that I wasn't entirely happy with that I wanted to try and iron out. First of which was the mana base, and second of all was the sideboard. So I kind of put the deck on the back burner that I was just planning to return to try and fix those things, and then I just kind of got sidetracked trying other decks and never really found the time to come back to this one, which is why I didn't cover it on the channel until now. Then fast forward a little bit, Brian just messaged me saying, I'm playing in the Arena Championship 4, I'm not too familiar with Historic, would you be willing to help me out? And I definitely was, and basically I just sent him a bunch of lists that I felt were really good, including this one. I definitely felt like this was a contender, and he tried them all out and just said to me, yeah, this is the one that I prefer the most. So we just decided to pick it and then just tried to tune it and worked on it a bunch running into the event. So if you're not familiar with this deck, it's essentially a combo deck with a go wide backup plan. So the combo, if you don't know, is Samwise Gamgee plus Cauldron Familiar and one of our free sacrifice outlets, either Woe Strider or Yawgmoth. So the way this works is, say we have Samwise and Cauldron Familiar in play, and we cast a Woe Strider, for example. When the Woe Strider enters the battlefield, it triggers the Samwise, which produces a food token. We can then sacrifice the Cauldron Familiar to the Woe Strider to put it in the graveyard. Then we can bring the Cauldron Familiar back with the food token that we get off Samwise. Cauldron Familiar enters the battlefield, which drains the opponent for 1, and then because of Samwise we get another food token. So we're back to square one here, but we've drained the opponent for 1 and got a scry off the Woe Strider. So we can just keep looping this over and over again, drain the opponent for infinite damage, and either get infinite scries or draw infinite cards off the Yawgmoth. Now obviously, you're limited for the number of cards that you've got in your deck for the Yawgmoth, but that basically never comes up, right? You're always going to have enough cards in the library for this to be able to win you the game. And because we're gaining life off the Cauldron Familiar, that basically offsets the downside of having to pay a life on the Yawgmoth as well. The other really nice thing about this specific combo is that since Cauldron Familiar causes the opponent to lose life rather than be targeted damage, it also enables us to win through the protection from the One Ring as well, which is a really big deal. So this is kind of the core combo of the deck. Most Samwise decks were also on some mana dorks, so we've got 4 Delighted Halfling, 4 Gilded Goose here, just to accelerate the deck, enable us to get the combo online faster, enable us to ramp into our cards like Woe Strider and Yawgmoth a little bit earlier. The reason that we've got Halfling and Goose here over other options like Avacyn's Pilgrim or Llanowar Elves is purely because of Bowmasters, right? You can't afford to be running 1 toughness mana dorks in this format, so Halfling and Goose having 2 toughness is really, really big. Delighted Halfling also giving our legendary creatures uncounterable is pretty huge as well. We don't have too many in the main deck, Samwise and Yawgmoth being the main ones, but especially against Dimir control, the ability to give Erasta uncounterable is really, really big, so that definitely does come up in certain matchups as well. Then we've got Gilded Goose here as well, which is Obviously worse in general because we have to use the food in order to use the ramp, which means that it is oftentimes just going to be single use, but because we can produce a bunch of food off the Samwise, it's often really not the case, right? You can go Gilded Goose on turn 1, into Samwise, into another 1-drop, and then we get the food back straight away, so then we can just use the Gilded Goose again the following turn. So Goose works really nicely in this list because we have food payoffs in Samwise and Cauldron Familiar as well. So this is kind of the core of the deck that most versions were running, right? We've got the ramp, we've got the combo, and then another staple card that was running almost all of the decks was Chord of Calling as well. And unsurprisingly, this card is just really, really sick at increasing the consistency of the deck because we can use this to just tutor up combo pieces, right? So if we have Samwise and a Sacrifice outlet, we can use Chord of Calling to find the Familiar. If we have Familiar in a sack outlet, we can use the Chord to find the Samwise. So really increases the consistency of finding your combo pieces. And then also has the really nice upside of allowing you to run one-ofs as Silver Bullet tutor targets like Skyclave Apparition and Haywire Might, or Archon of Emeria and Dranon and Varlet in the sideboard as well. So Chord of Calling was really sick. And then that was kind of the core of the deck. I know a lot of people were very high on running stuff like Collected Company in the deck alongside some other combos. I know some people were running it alongside Scurry Oak and Rosie, and then more recently Confectioner and Peregrine took, but I really feel like the Convoke builds with Ropeline Attendant and Knight Errant Evios are better, just because it gives the deck a really solid secondary angle of attack that isn't vulnerable to single target removal. I feel like the main way outside of hate pieces that people are trying to interact with you is single target removal, and specifically with hate pieces as well, you are weak to Stone of Erech, you are weak to Pithing Needle because they can needle the Cauldron Familiar to stop you comboing off. So using Ropeline Attendant and Knight Errant Evios not only does help with our proactive game plan as well, because Knight Errant Evios is really good at finding the combo pieces, but it gives you a secondary angle of attack, so you're not weak to single target removal because you can go wide very effectively, and there aren't that many sweepers in the format right now outside of Dimir Control. And you also have a really solid way to just beat the cards like Pithing Needle, like Stone of Erech, and we also in matchups where the opponent did have a lot of single target removal, we were boarding out or trimming the combo and just relying on our go wide aggressive game plan. And if you are running, Collected Company and other combo cards, that makes you very weak to those same things. So using Knight Errant Evios and the Convoke cards not only gives you a very quick start, right? Ropeline Attendant in particular gives you incredibly fast starts in this deck, but it also just gives you a way to pivot post sideboard against the interactive decks and just a secondary angle of attack, which I think is really important right now, especially when there is a lot of hate for creature combos because of the prevalence of decks like Yawgmoth and Kethis as well, which incidentally happen to hit this deck. So we'll have a little bit, we'll have a closer look at these two cards, starting off here with Ropeline Attendant, which I think is one of the most underrated cards in the format. I think this card is incredibly strong if you're running a very creature heavy deck, which we are, right? The only non-creature in the deck is Chord of Calling in the main deck anyway. So when Ropeline Attendant enters the battlefield, all of our creatures in our hand perpetually gain. When this creature enters the battlefield, we get a 1/1 green and white citizen creature token. So this is incredibly strong at allowing us to get our Convokes off in the early game, right? If we play this on turn 2, and then we start playing creatures, it's very, very easy for us to play Knight Errant Evios for free. It's very, very easy for us to start calling for 3 or 4 very early on, which is really, really huge. And then also just goes wide, right? The tokens are green and white as well, which enable us to use Chord or Knight Errant Evios because they're white and green respectively. And like I said, it's just a nightmare for decks that are relying on single target removal to beat us, to keep up if we're just producing a bunch of tokens. It also has some really nice synergy with cards like Cauldron Familiar because we get the token whenever that creature enters the battlefield. So if we give Cauldron Familiar this ability and we start looping it from the graveyard with food and a sacrifice outlet, even when we're not comboing off, we get additional 1/1 tokens off that as well. So Ropeline Attendant, incredibly strong at enabling our Convoke payoffs and just enable us to go wide very effectively. Now, the obvious downside of this card is if you draw it later in the game and you don't have creatures in your hand, it is a fair bit worse, but this card really accelerates and also enables you to Goldfish faster, which is one of the big reasons why I like this deck a lot. This deck can Goldfish to the combo very, very quickly, which really gives it an edge against decks like Devotion and Kethis and, Cabaret Rebels, Goblins and other decks that are also trying to Goldfish themselves as well. The Knight Errant Evios is a really, really sick payoff in this deck as well. Again, gives us another top end payoff for our Convoke that we can almost always cast for 3 or 1 mana. And not only does it just give us a free 4/4 body, which is really good at, enabling our backup plan of just beating down in certain matchups, but it also helps us find our combo pieces as well, right? You get to look at the top 6. As I said, we're almost always going to be convoking for 4 or 5, which enables us to get basically any of the creatures off it, right? You can even chain Knight Errants together, convoke for 5 to find another Knight Errant for the following turn, which is a really strong, play. You can have a board of 15 or 20 creatures by turn 4 or 5 in this deck with the craziest starts involving Ropeline and Knight Errant of Eos. So this card is really nice because it just enables us to commit to the board faster, to enable our backup beat down game plan, whilst also helping us find our combo pieces or sideboard creatures as well. So I really, really like this interaction. It's felt really solid so far. And then the other cards in the deck, we've obviously got Orcish Bowmasters here, which is one of the best cards in the format. Very, very good against creature decks, very good against decks that are trying to draw cards, like if you're against the One Ring, or even against Wizards now that they're running Flame of Anor. This is a really nice upside as well. And then I also just feel like this is one of the best Bowmasters decks in the format because we can really utilize the amass token, right? We pay two mana, we get 2 creatures, which basically just pays for itself if we're planning to cast a Knight Errant or Chord of Calling. So this deck is one of the best Bowmasters decks in the format, I think. Then some one-offs that we've got in the deck. Initially, I wasn't running Might and Apparition in the main deck. I was running them in the sideboard, and I did have 2 Young Wolves in the main deck, which I do think is a generically good card in this deck, right? They're both 1-drops, so they enable a Convoke game plan. If you Ropeline Attendant on a Young Wolf, you can also, essentially draw infinite cards off the Yawgmoth, but I just felt like Young Wolf was the weak link in the deck. It didn't really synergize that strongly. And the really nice thing about putting Haywire Might and Apparition in the main deck is it gives you more outs to stuff, which is particularly important when Devotion started seeing more play, because having main deck answers to the artifacts that they can pull off the sideboard with Karn, like Pithy Needle, for example, or having main deck Apparition for Devotion decks that were running Huntmaster to be able to pull your Shan is really nice. So And the other nice upside of running Apparition and Might in the main deck is it just frees up sideboard space as well, which is pretty big. So Haywire Might is nice here as just a 1-drop, so it plays nicely with our Convoke cards, but being able to fetch this to answer the One Ring or just any problematic artifact or enchantment is pretty huge. Also gains you a life, so enables you to activate Yawgmoth more often, which is pretty nice. And then Apparition, just a nice catch-all answer for anything. Gives us some main deck removal, which is nice against a deck like Wizards. Very nice against a deck like Devotion as well, to be able to answer any of their early stuff as well. So I felt like these as one-offs were very nice to have access to in the main deck. And like I said, it did free up sideboard space having them in the main deck as well. Then some of the other cards as well, obviously Samwise is nice as part of the combo, but it also has the ability to bring back a historic card from your graveyard to your hand, which you can use it to loop Haywire Mights if you need to kill multiple things. You can get Yawgmoth back. If you have multiple Samwises, you can keep looping them, which is very good against decks that are relying on single target removal. And then obviously we have stuff like Arasta and Adrenaline Vala post-sideboard as well, which is very nice. And then Yawgmoth is here for a number of reasons as well. So first of all, it's just nice as another sacrifice outlet. So if the opponent does Pithing Needle Woe Strider, for example, we can just combo off the Yawgmoth. Now, it's almost always best for the opponent to needle the familiar, so that's not, and most people have caught on to that now, so that's not the primary reason it's here. The main reason it's here is just because it's such a great card to have access to off Chord of Calling when you just have a wide board and nothing much else going on, right? If you're at parity and you're trying to pull ahead, being able to Chord for 4, get Yawgmoth in play, start being able to pick off the opponent's board if they are playing a creature deck, or even if they're not, just being able to sacrifice your creatures to draw a card to allow you to pull ahead on card advantage is really huge. So Yawgmoth, not only great to enable the combo, but it's just really, really good as a value card. When you have, just a bunch of creatures in play, you can just Chord for 4 and just start immediately pulling ahead. So Yawgmoth has felt really, really solid in this list for sure, and is a key part of our game plan when we do board out of the combo in certain matchups as well. Then in terms of the mana base, this was one of the sketchiest parts of the deck initially. I do feel like the mana base just about works. You are very occasionally going to run into some situations where the mana base just doesn't cooperate, but for the most part, it just about works. The downside of it is it's very painful, right? We've got 4 mana Confluence, which is an absolute must, right? Because the downside of this deck is we're a very, very low to the ground creature deck. We really want to be able to curve out each turn, and we have cards of every single colour in the early game, right? We need green on turn 1, we need black on turn 2, we need green-white on turn 2, and white-black when we board in the Juggernaut Peddler as well. So Confluence is an absolute must, even though it deals a bunch of damage to you. And then we've got a bunch of fast lands and shock lands, so again, very, very painful mana base, but we also have a decent amount of life gain in the deck, off the food tokens, off Gilded Goose, off the Cauldron Familiar, and the Haywire Might as well, so it's not really too much of an issue. I still like running a single basic land, especially if you're playing this on the ladder, to be able to avoid stuff like Field of Ruin in particular. And so, yeah, the mana base is one of the weakest parts of the deck in general because you do take a lot of damage off it, but it is consistent enough as it is. In terms of the number of lands, you've got 21, which has definitely felt like a decent amount, right? We have a very low curve in general. We are going wide, which makes the Convoke cards essentially free in a lot of situations, and we have 8 mana dorks as well. So 21 lands has definitely felt like a good amount to me overall. So now moving on to the sideboard, starting off here with 4 copies of Fatal Push, which is here primarily for Is It Wizards, but if you're playing this on the ladder, it's just very good against any linear creature deck that demands early interaction, stuff like Hammer Time or Auras, but primarily for Wizards. So going into this weekend, I very much saw Mono Green Devotion as the deck to beat, and I really feel like a lot of people could have brought Izzet Wizards because it has the best matchup against Mono Green Devotion, and then on top of that, it's also really solid against all of the other creature-based combos. It's really good against this Samwise deck, it's really good against Yawgmoth, it's really good against Kethis. Now, it is very weak to the Dimir Control and Rakdos on Gen mid-range decks, but because of the presence of Mono Green Devotion, pushing those sorts of decks out of the format, I did feel like Wizards would be a really good choice in this metagame, and I did expect a few people to identify that, and that definitely ended up being the case considering Wizards took down the whole tournament. So I really did feel like we couldn't afford to run this deck if we didn't have a good sideboard plan against Wizards, because game 1 against Wizards is horrendous, because we're a very high synergy creature-based deck without, basically no interaction in the main deck outside of Skyclave Apparition and Yawgmoth, which is really slow. And post-sideboard, we really can't afford to bring in that much removal without diluting our proactive synergies as well. So we really struggled to kill their creatures, and then on top of that, all of our creatures trade so poorly with their interaction as well. They have a ton of burn spells. All of our combo pieces have 2 or less toughness, which makes it basically impossible to combo off because all of their burn spells can just kill our creatures. So the matchup game 1 is just horrendous, and I felt like we really needed to have some sort of transformative sideboard plan, or we're just conceding the Wizards matchup, which I just don't think is viable. When I did expect it to be popular deck, I did expect it to be a good meta call. So I really tried to rack my brain for a good sideboard plan against Wizards. 4 Fatal Push is kind of a given. It's just one of the best cards against Wizards. But in terms of what to add in addition to that, I was racking my brain. And that brings me on to the next card, which I think was the all-star from the sideboard. This card worked so well over the weekend, was Arasta of the Endless Web. So like I said, I was racking my brain for sideboard cards that could really flip the Wizards matchup on its head post-sideboard. We tried extra removal, stuff like Pylon and Cut Down, but then it felt like we diluted our synergies a little bit too much. Tried stuff like Crawl Harpooner, which is really good in certain spots, but if the opponent has non-flying creatures like Dreadhorde Arcanist or Soulscar Mage, it didn't really work. And then I was just trying to think, and I was like, remembered Arasta of the Endless Web back from the Phoenix days. This used to be a really, really solid sideboard card against Izzet Phoenix. Now, I was a little bit worried about Flame of Anor. The recent addition of Flame of Anor to Wizards does mean that they can cleanly kill this. However, we still get the 1/2 token, and that is the absolute best case scenario for the Wizards player. If they don't have a Flame of Anor, this is a nightmare for them to deal with. And 3 copies might seem like a lot, but like I said, I felt like Wizards was going to be a popular deck, and we really needed to transform in order to beat Wizards. And so 3 Rasta, 4 Fatal Push really helps to flip that matchup on its head. Game 1, you're almost always going to be losing, but post-sideboard, with 4 Push and 3 Rasta, you do need to mulligan a little bit more aggressively to try and find these, but if you do find them, it can help flip that matchup on its head, and that definitely happened. We're going to see a matchup against Wizards from coverage later in the video. And so, yeah, I'm really happy that we came through with a Rasta. It really, really did help to flip that Wizards matchup on its head. And then on top of that, it also turns out that it's a very good sideboard card against Dimir Control as well. So initially, we added it to the sideboard specifically for the Wizards matchup, but we were testing the Dimir matchup, and our sideboard plan didn't really quite work out. So we thought, why don't we try a Rasta? And this card is really, really difficult for the Dimir deck to deal with because their primary sweeper is Languish, which is probably the best card against our deck, right? We are a go-wide creature deck, particularly with the Convoke and Ropeline Attendant game plan. And so Arasta surviving Languish is really, really sick. Their other sweeper of choice, Extinction Event, is very good against Arasta because if they name even, it deals with Arasta and all the tokens as well. But that doesn't mop up our entire board. It doesn't deal with any of our odd creatures if they do that as well. And their deck is primarily single target removal. So if we can get this in play, then and they have stuff like Shieldred's Edict or Fatal Push or whatever, it's very difficult for them to cleanly deal with it. Fatal Push obviously does trade up with Arasta very well, but the Dimir Control deck doesn't actually have that many ways to trigger Revolt, right? They have some number of Fabled Passage, but not that many. They also have Orcish Bowmasters, but they have to use the Bowmasters to kill their own creature for that to trigger Revolt, which is obviously a good exchange for us as well. And there will obviously just be a lot of spots where they just aren't able to deal with this cleanly. They maybe have to use the Sauron's Ransom or Memory Deluge to find an answer to it, in which case we start producing a bunch of tokens. And the really nice thing about this as well is the tokens that Arasta produces also work very nicely with our Convoke game plans. So, you'd get an Arasta in play, the opponent would trigger it a couple of times to make some spiders, and then suddenly Call of Calling can call for 4, then you can get Yawgmoth in play, which can start sacrificing the spider tokens to get card advantage as well. And then on top of that, which was very useful against Dimir Control, it also gets uncounterable off Delighted Halfling. So if the opponent does keep a very counterspell heavy hand against you, and you go turn 1 Halfling, turn 3 Arasta, that's really solid. So not only is this the sideboard card of choice against Wizards, but it's also very nice against Dimir Control as well. well, which ended up being very relevant over the weekend. Then outside of that, we've also got 3 copies of Elven Chorus, which is really, really sick in this deck. Being able to play off the top of the library and turn all of your creatures into mana dorks is really huge, especially when we're going wide, right? If you go Ropeline Attendant into a few creatures to go super wide, and then Elven Chorus, and you have 5 or 6 creatures in play that can help you cast creatures off the top, it's really huge. So this is primarily here for the mid-range matchups and Dimir control, as just card advantage engines that are really hard for them to deal with. Rakdos midrange specifically just has no good way to deal with this unless they're sideboarding Feed the Swarm. And even Juns, they have to find their Terra Sunder or Haywire Might very quickly, or this just runs away with the game. Can even outscale the One Ring in terms of the amount of card advantage that it can produce. And then very similarly, so good against Dimir control as well. Our primary game plan against Dimir control was to ideally have an Elven Chorus in hand and then just commit to the board, force them to tap out for a sweeper, and then when they're tapped out, you resolve the Elven Chorus. And the only way that most of the stock Dimir builds had of dealing with the Elven Chorus was the single copy of Commit to Memory. So if they couldn't find that, Elven Chorus, once it's resolved against Dimir control, is almost always going to be good enough to win you the game as well. So 3 copies might seem like a lot again, but it was so good against both Dimir control and the mid-range deck that I really wanted to be running a lot of copies of this. Again, it also pairs very nicely with Knight Errant at Vios. We can get a bunch of creatures in play and then just cast it for free off the top with Knight Errant. So Elven Chorus, absolute all-star against mid-range and control. And then we've got 2 copies of Juggernaut Peddler, which is really, really good as well. First of all, against Dimir control, it's essentially a Thoughtseize on a creature, which is great. The Juggernaut basically doesn't matter at all because we're a combo deck. We're trying to set up a combo. We don't care if the opponent plays a 5-3. And if the control deck taps out to play a 5-3, that's exactly what we want to be doing anyway. And then on top of that, it's also very useful against combo decks, specifically Yawgmoth. Juggernaut Peddler is so important because the Yawgmoth matchup is pretty interesting, where our deck goldfishes to our combo a lot faster than the Yawgmoth deck does for sure, so we can often outrace. But the issue is, even if the Yawgmoth opponent can't get off the combo, if they can resolve a Yawgmoth before you combo off, they can just cut you off the combo very easily because Yawgmoth can kill your creatures at instant speed. So having access to Juggernaut Peddler as a way to try and get rid of the opponent's Yawgmoth is absolutely huge, because the Yawgmoth deck, if they keep a bunch of, the deck is essentially small creatures and Yawgmoth and ways to find Yawgmoth. So if they have a hand of small creatures and Yawgmoth, and you can get a Peddler down early, get rid of the Yawgmoth, their deck looks really unimpressive. And Juggernaut Peddler is just nice to be able to play on turn 2, but it's also incredibly useful to be able to Chord of Calling as well. If you can't combo against Yawgmoth, the best play is to just wait until their draw step, allow them to draw a card, Chord for X=2 for Juggernaut Peddler, and just hope they don't have more than one Yawgmoth in hand, or ways to find Yawgmoth. Now, 2 copies felt really good. The one change that I would make going forwards is cut a Remorseful Cleric for the 3rd Juggernaut Peddler, specifically for the Yawgmoth matchup, because finding this in your opening hand really, really improves the Yawgmoth matchup a lot. Speaking of Remorseful Cleric, so this is here, first of all, as a good chord target against the Kethis combo. So we do have some other very good cards to chord for against Kethis, like Orcan of Emeria and Dranet Linvala, that I'll get to in a second. These both shut off the combo against Kethis, but the main reason that Remorseful Cleric was here was for situations where you can only chord for X=2 as a way to shut off the combo. You can chord for Remorseful Cleric, activate it to shut off the combo, and force them to have to refuel their graveyard. And I also like having access to Remorseful Cleric because otherwise the deck just doesn't have good ways to interact with decks like Reanimator or Dredge. Now, I didn't expect either of those decks to be very popular, so this was definitely probably a mistake in the sideboard. Again, it potentially comes up against Kethis combo, which was a represented deck, but I definitely feel like going forwards, I would replace this Remorseful Cleric with the 3rd Juggernaut Peddler. So in the deck list that I'm going to link in the description, I will just replace Remorseful Cleric with Peddler, because I do feel like there's just a better configuration going forward. If graveyard decks do become more popular, then I definitely think it's worth running this, or maybe Viconia if the graveyard decks are running single target stuff. But yeah, in general, I do think I would prefer to run a Peddler going forwards. But against Kethis, if you have Peddler instead of Remorseful Cleric and the opponent already has a Kethis in play, you do kind of wish you had the Cleric, so I think it's a defensible choice. And the other thing is, I didn't know what the decks would be going into this, right? When we submitted our deck list, we didn't know what everyone else would be running, so I thought there was still a chance that somebody might bring something like Reanimator. So had I seen the deck list beforehand, I definitely would have made this choice. And going forwards, like I said, you want to be replacing Remorseful Cleric with the 3rd Juggernaut Peddler to improve the Yawgmoth and Dimir control matchups a little bit more. And we've got a single copy of Archon of Emeria, so this is another Chord of Calling tutor target that is very good against both Mono Green Devotion and Kethis combo. So against Mono Green Devotion, it really limits their ability to develop to the board. Devotion is all about having crazy turns where they just spam a bunch of stuff in one turn, and Archon just limiting their ability to do that really slows down their early game plan. Now, Devotion in general is a really solid matchup. You can outrace them when they don't have much interaction, but you're not always going to have opening hands with the combo, and so being able to just get creatures in play and then Chord of Calling for Archon of Emeria is a really, really solid way of just buying you time in that matchup. And then, as I mentioned, also very, very good against Kethis, just stopping them comboing off until they can find a Fatal Push as well. And then finally, Juggernaut and Linvala is another really big reason to be running this deck. I think this card really, really gives you an edge in the mirror match against other creature-based combo decks. Incredibly good against Yawgmoth, because it not only stops their ability to use their Yawgmoth, but gives Juggernaut and Linvala Yawgmoth's ability as well. And then very good in the mirror match, very, very good against Kethis combo as well. And the other thing with Kethis combo is I felt like a lot of decks would be relying on Pithing Needle as a way to shut off the creature-based combo decks like Yawgmoth and Kethis. And with the addition of Agatha's Soul Cauldron, Pithing Needle isn't actually that effective against Kethis combo anymore, whereas Juggernaut and Linvala really, really is. So I felt like this card really gives you an edge against the other creature-based combo decks as well. So before I move into the matchup spread, I wanted to highlight sideboarding in two specific matchups, because I am going to be doing a full sideboard guide in the MTGAzone Premium article, so I'm not going to go into too many here, but if you're thinking of picking this deck up, sideboarding against Izzet Wizards and Dimir Control is very unintuitive, so I wanted to highlight it here just for the people who are thinking of picking this deck up. So those are both decks that are very interactive, and where pulling off the combo is very difficult to achieve. So specifically against Izzet Wizards, they have so many burn spells that just trade so well with our combo pieces. And so what we do in that matchup is we just board out of almost all of the combo. So we obviously want to be bringing in 4 Fatal Push, 3 Arasta. These are by far the best cards in the matchup. But like I said, Woe Strider, Samwise are so bad against their burn spells that I also bring in 2 copies of Juggernaut Peddler, which might seem a bit odd. You know, Thoughtseize style effects are traditionally pretty bad against aggro decks, but Izzet Wizards has a lot of very high impact cards, so replacing one of their 2-drop creatures with a Juggernaut, or replacing like a Flame of Anor or a key burn spell with a Juggernaut, is way better than just casting a Samwise and having it killed. So what we do is we bring in 9 cards, we bring in 4 Fatal Push, 3 Arasta, 2 Juggernaut Peddler, and we're boarding out 4 Woe Strider, 3 Samwise, and 2 Cauldron Familiar. So we still have access to the combo potentially, right? We have 2 Familiar left, 1 Samwise, and we still have Yawgmoth as a sacrifice outlet. But like I said, the combo pieces trade so poorly with their burn spells that we want removal. Arasta is just the best card in the matchup, and Juggernaut Peddler is just better than all of the combo pieces. So that's how you board out. Cut 4 Strider, 3 Samwise, 2 Familiar. And then against Dimir Control, we want to be bringing in the 2 Juggernaut Peddler, 3 Elven Chorus, 3 Arasta, so we've got 8 cards to bring in. And here, because we're increasing the curve of the deck quite a lot, we can't really consistently convoke the Knight Errant here, right? We're bringing in 3 4-drops, we're bringing in 3 4-drops here as well, and we are bringing in 2 2-drops, but you can't really convoke Knight Errant when you're bringing in so many more expensive cards. So in order to make room for these 8 cards, we cut the Knight Errant, we cut the Haywire Might, because we have Apparition as an answer to Stone of Erec or Pithing Needle if we need, and then we trim 1 of each combo piece. So cut 4 Knight Errant, cut 1 Haywire Might, cut 1 Cauldron Familiar, cut 1 Samwise, cut 1 Woe Strider. So I wanted to highlight those 2 matchups because they are matchups that can feel tricky post-sideboard if you don't know how to sideboard, if that makes sense. So in terms of the matchups, the decks that were brought were pretty much exactly as I predicted. I thought the metagame would be Devotion, Dimir Control, Yawgmoth and Kethis combo, Izzet Wizards, and the mid-range decks like Rakdos and Jund, and that panned out exactly as I predicted, so I was really happy about that. In terms of the matchup spreads, against Devotion, the deck is really, really good. Devotion basically has no way to interact with you in the early game, and you're one of the fastest combo decks you can win on turn 3 or 4, so it's very, very difficult for Devotion to beat you. Now, some Devotion decks were running Yasharn either in the sideboard or, you know, as a way to fetch with Grizzled Huntmaster, but even the Huntmaster builds, which were the worst for us, I still felt like were really good matchups, and we do have Apparition to fetch in the main deck against Yasharn as well. So overall, I felt like the Devotion matchup was really good, which is one of the main reasons that I was happy to be running this deck this weekend, because I felt like Devotion would be popular. We didn't face it, unfortunately. I felt like that would have been kind of a free win for this deck, but very, very solid matchup against Devotion, which is great. Then against Dimir Control, I felt like the deck was pretty solid as well. Definitely a lot closer than the Devotion matchup, and game 1 can be a bit dicey, but we do have both Chord of Calling and Orcish Bowmasters, which are very, very solid cards in the matchup. Playing at instant speed makes it really difficult for the opponent to interact with you safely. And then post-sideboard, I did feel like the matchup improved a fair bit because of Arasta, Elven Chorus, and Juggernaut Peddler. Juggernaut Peddler being able to clear the way is huge. Being able to Chord of Calling for Juggernaut Peddler is also really big because not only is Chord of Calling difficult for the opponent to interact with, but if they do let it go, then we can Peddler, get rid of the most problematic card for their hand, which a lot of the time will be a board sweeper to protect our board, but being able to Chord of Calling either during the opponent's draw step or their end step for Juggernaut Peddler is a really huge play to have access to. And then Elven Chorus is so hard for them to answer once it's in play. So again, a lot of your game plans post sideboard are, if you have a chorus in hand, just commit to the board early, force them to sweep, because another great thing about this deck, because we're very go wide and we have stuff like Ropeline Attendant still in the deck post sideboard, is we can get down and outscale their single target removal very consistently, which then means they rely on the Languish. So if you force them to then tap out for the Languish, they're then tapped out for you to resolve the Elven Chorus, and then they basically just lose the game from that point onwards. Commit to Memory is their only answer to it, really, and then you just play off the top of your library from there on as well. And then Arasta, again, as I mentioned, very difficult for them to deal with. If we can get it in play off Delighted Halfling, it's also uncounterable as well. So Dimir Control is a close matchup, but I definitely feel like it's favoured for us post-sideboard from my experience as well. Then Yawgmoth is definitely a tricky matchup. We do Goldfish to our combo faster than them, but as I mentioned, the issue is if they can land a Yawgmoth itself, that can just cut us off the combo because they can kill our creatures at instant speed. So again, it's another matchup where Juggernaut Peddler is really important. Being able to Peddler away their Yawgmoth before they can get it into play is really huge, which is another reason why I want that third Peddler over the Cleric. But in general, I think Yawgmoth is favoured for you if you can get rid of their Yawgmoth, or you can combo off before they can find their Yawgmoth, which can happen in a lot of scenarios. You can also sometimes just go super wide very quickly, right? I've had matchups where you can get 8 or 9 creatures in play, and then even though the opponent can land a turn 3 or 4 Yawgmoth, they don't have enough creatures in play to pick apart your board, and then you can just either attack round it or find an apparition to answer the Yawgmoth. So I think Yawgmoth in general is probably a little unfavoured, but I feel like if you replace Remorseful Cleric with the third Juggernaut Peddler, post-sideboard it becomes a lot more, in your favour, because if you can Peddler away their Yawgmoth, their deck just kind of falls apart a little bit. So Yawgmoth should definitely improve by running the third Peddler, but I do feel like it's a very close matchup and a definitely winnable matchup for sure. Then Kethis combo, again, is another matchup I felt pretty good about. Again, a lot of the time, game 1, it's 2 ships passing in the night. Whoever can combo off faster game 1 has a pretty big advantage. Post-sideboard, we do have a lot of good tools like, Archon of Emuria and Dranolin Vala are particularly very, very good against them. And then that's also another matchup where Juggernaut Peddler can pull its weight. Having said that, they also have a decent number of sideboard cards against you. Urza's Ruinous Blast is very good if they can get it off. Some lists were also running Yasharn in the sideboard as well, so Juggernaut Peddler is a way to clear the way for those, is pretty good. So Kethis, again, quite a close matchup, but I definitely feel like we have good tools to win that matchup as well. Then in terms of the mid-range decks like Rakdos and Jund, I felt like this deck was really solid there as well. They don't typically run very many sweepers anymore, and you can go super wide with this deck. It's very difficult for them to efficiently answer the Knight Errant, and then post-sideboard we have Elven Chorus as well, so... And the other thing is, this deck is actively happy if the opponent taps out for the One Ring in a lot of scenarios, because it means their shield's down. We can combo through the One Ring as well. So again, I felt very comfortable in the Rakdos and Jund mid-range matchups for sure as well. And then Is It Wizards is obviously the worst matchup for us game 1. But like I said, we do have Fatal Push and Arasta. So I think post-sideboard, as long as you mulligan a little more aggressively to these cards, you are favoured. But the thing is, if you don't find those cards, or the Wizards player can potentially win through those. So Wizards is definitely the scariest deck to face with this list, but we do have a solid sideboard plan, and that was the key with this deck. I wanted to have good game plans for all of the trickier matchups, so I think Wizards is definitely the worst matchup, but post-sideboard we have a solid way to win for sure, so even there we have a good way to win. Yawgmoth, again, another tricky matchup, but again, we have the Peddlers here, we have Dranit and Ninvala, so we have good ways to win in that matchup. And again, Kethis, another tricky matchup that's quite even as well, but again, we have solid sideboard plans, so even though the deck does have some close and tricky matchups, the really nice thing that I was happy about this deck is we have solid game plans for all of those matchups, which is really great for ladder play, right? You are going to queue into those matchups, so having a game plan to potentially win your bad matchups is really solid. And the other really nice thing about this deck is, obviously on ladder you are going to face a bigger variety of decks than you're likely to see in a small tournament like this, and I feel like this deck is very generically powerful and should be good to fight any of the 2 the tier 2 or 3 decks that you're likely to come across in ladder as well. So I felt like the deck definitely does have some tricky matchups, but this particular version of the deck has a solid game plan for each of those, if that makes sense. So before I move into the gameplay that I got coming up, I'm going to be analysing some of the matches that were highlighted on coverage over the weekend. I've just got a quick chat that I had with Brian about the, his tournament experience and how the deck performed. So big shouts to Brian for hopping on the video. So congrats again, Brian, for the top 8. Really, really buzzing for you. So how was the tournament overall, and do you think the deck performed as well as you'd hoped?
Yeah, I think the deck did great. For those of you that don't know, me and Altheriax worked on the deck for several weeks and did a lot of testing right before the event. 2 matchups that were kind of difficult were blue-black control and blue-red wizards. And we originally put Arasta in the sideboard for the wizards matchup, but when the Archetype breakdown came out on Friday, we saw how much blue-black control there was. And we're looking at the sideboard testing, having some issues, and just tried out Arasta, and it was great in that matchup as well. So overall, the deck was really good, and Arasta out of the sideboard was definitely the MVP.
Yeah, I was so happy to see that one in coverage pay off. Going forwards after the event, are there any changes you'd make? Because I was looking at it this morning, and I think one thing I would potentially change going forward is getting rid of that Remorseful Cleric. I didn't really feel that one was very useful outside of Kethis, and maybe look to run the 3rd Peddler to improve the Yawgmoth matchup a little bit. Is there anything else that you thought you'd change, or were you pretty happy with it?
I was pretty happy with the main deck, so I'm not sure I would look to change anything there. I think Remorseful Cleric was definitely the weakest card in the sideboard.
Yeah, I think I put that one there mainly for Kethis, but obviously before the deck list came out, I didn't really know what everyone else would be running, so I didn't know if there'd be people on Reanimator or something weird like that. But yeah, everything else felt super important, and I'm so happy that the Arrestas came through.
Yeah, I think 3rd Peddler could have potentially been good, and also one card that we cut from the original sideboard was Viconia, and maybe that would have been decent against blue-black, just so we can kill their Snapcaster and Lyris targets.
Yeah, that's a good shout, actually, because that was the other thing. I wasn't sure exactly which build of Dimir people would be running. I kind of anticipated people would be on the One Ring build, but yeah, it was kind of crazy that all 6 were on Snapcaster, so maybe Viconia instead of Remorseful Cleric could be another good swap, and it would also be good in the mirror as well at stopping the combo and stuff like that. So yeah, that's a decent shout as well. So yeah, I'm really happy to see you get the top 8. Bit gutted you didn't make it in the top 8 after playing the same guy in the round before, but top 8 is still sick, and yeah, really glad to see the deck did well. Anything else that you want to say before we head off?
No, I think the deck was very good though. My record ended up being 5-2. I beat the Mirror, I beat blue-black twice, I beat Wizards, and Kethis. The one time played Kethis, I beat it, and I ended up losing to just Yawgmoth and then blue-black in top 8. And the top 8...
I was going to say, shame we didn't see any Devotion, because that was the main matchup where the deck just felt pretty easy for that win, but...
Yeah, that was a little bit unlucky, but we played through a lot of borderline close matchups and won most of them. The top 8 match was very intense. Unfortunate that they didn't show that, but it was super close in 3. And yeah, I feel like that one could have gone either way, to be honest.
Yeah. Still though, top 8 6, so congrats again, man.
All right, yeah, man, appreciate it.
So what I'm going to do next is I've got a couple matches queued up from coverage over the weekend where this deck was in action. So it'll be some gameplay so you guys can see the deck in action. And I'm going to be commentating over the games, talking you through the different lines, talking you through our general strategy for those game plans as well. So if you enjoyed this sort of video and you'd like to see me do it more in future, if I do help prep for events or if I'm playing in events myself, I'd be very happy to do this sort of video again in the future. Definitely let me know in the comments. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video and I'll catch you all in the next one. Big up. Okay, so here we've got the matchup against Shinya Saito. So this is a tough one because Shinya is the only undefeated player in the tournament so far, and Wizards is definitely the trickiest matchup, or it's the matchup that we're most scared of. Again, we got a solid sideboard plan, but we're really not expecting to win game 1. Brian's on the draw and he has to mull a little bit. I do think this is definitely a defensible 6 to keep. You can't really keep that 7. It's just too, you got too many lands there. This hand does have a game plan, but again, game 1 against Wizards is just so tricky because their interaction just lines up so well against your combo pieces. So yeah, I do like this keep. You do have a decent game plan. You've got either Bowmasters or Ropeplan on turn 2, and then you can potentially start cording for stuff. Getting the combo off is tricky, but you can potentially cord for Apparition to kill their creatures if they have a creature light draw. You can also potentially, cord for a Yawgmoth if you start getting wide. And Ropeplan is just the best play on turn 2 in almost all situations. If the opponent had a 1 toughness creature that you needed to kill, like a Llanowar Elves or something, then Bowmasters on 2 is pretty defensible, but you really want to get Ropeplan down early just to get that ability, help you go wide, especially when you have a Call of Calling in hand. Now here's a tricky spot. Brian misses his 3rd land. So the only options you got here are either Bowmasters or 2 Geese. Because, you are a little choked on mana and you do want to ideally get this Chord of Calling online, I like the line that Brian goes for here of just getting 2 Gilded Gooses into play. The opponent's also just used, some interactions. There's a chance they might be slightly lower on burn spells. And the Geese in play here also can potentially allow us to chump block the Symmetry Swage, which is nice. And then here we're already seeing the value of the Ropeplan Attendant. We've already got a 1-1 in play, which is very nice, blocking the Soulscar Mage. So I think in this point, you kind of just got to hope that the Wizards player doesn't have as many burn spells remaining. They do run a decent amount of cantrips and creatures as well, so there's a chance they don't have that many burn spells left. Even if they have 1, we still have 2 creatures in play. If we can hit the 3rd land, we can play Woestrider, which with the Ropeplan Attendant buff actually pays for itself with the Chord of Calling, because you get 3 creatures in play, which then you can just use to Chord of Calling, which is pretty nice. But yeah, in this spot, on the draw, missing the land drop and one of the lands being Confluence is pretty rough, and in general you're just not expecting to win the game 1 against Wizards at all. In testing, very very rarely won game 1 against Wizards, but post sideboard things should definitely improve a decent amount because of the Fatal Pushes and the Erastas. So they have the Reckless Rage here, which does take out one of the Gilded Gooses here, which is a tricky, right? We're already at 12, so we're probably forced to make chump blocks here, which then makes getting Chord of Calling online even more difficult. We do have the Woestrider, but in order to combo off, we need 2 more pieces, and we don't really have that many good fair options. In order to win the fair game 1 against Wizards, you really need to have Knight Errant of Eos, which this hand doesn't have, and ideally you want to be on the play as well. So here's a tricky spot. What we want to block with. I do like the play here. You kind of want to soak up the damage from the Soulscar Mage the most because it's representing more damage. And the Gilded Goose is more valuable because it can block these Symmetry Sages in the air. 3rd land is found, which is very important here. And now you've got the choice between whether you want to play the Woestrider, which does put 3 creatures into play and does potentially allow you to chord for 1. So you can, potentially get another Gilded Goose to block. You could potentially get a Cauldron Familiar. Or you can wait and play the Orcish Bowmasters, which I think I prefer the Bowmasters play here, right? If you go for Woestrider, you are essentially tapped out. If the opponent has another burn spell, then that shuts off the chord, because you need to keep, ideally you want to block, and then with the blockers on the stack, essentially, you can then chord in response. Bowmasters here is really nice because it just allows you consistent ways to block the Soulscar Mage, gets multiple bodies in play for next turn to then potentially allow you to chord. And in this spot, obviously from Brian's seat, we didn't know this situation, and it's looking good now that we know Shinya's hand, right? He's out of spells entirely, so if he doesn't find another spell off this Fiery Islet, we're in a really good spot. Now, if they do fire up the Den of the Bugbear, Orcish Bowmasters is looking really good here as well. But from Brian's seat, I think you are so far behind at this point that you just need to hope the opponent runs out of gas, which did happen in this situation. So either way, I definitely prefer the Bowmasters play here as well, because you can soak up the damage from the Soulscar Mage and potentially block the Symmetry Sage depending on what they do here. So the attack without casting a spell beforehand isn't necessarily like a big red flag that they don't have anything here, because they do have a lot of instant speed stuff, and they can just buff both the Symmetry Sages at instant speed here. I think either way, you're kind of forced to just flash off the Bowmasters here regardless, right? You do want to get a blocker in play because you are expecting the Wizards player to cast something at instant speed here. So I like flashing in the Bowmasters. I don't think it makes much sense to go after the Soulscar Mage. So yeah, very heads up play from Shinya there. Goes for the Fiery Islet before the Bowmasters enters play to avoid getting the second trigger. And they do draw the Flame of Anor, which is rough. But from Brian's side, you're kind of just expecting them to have something hit anyway. So, and again, Wizards player is forced to draw 2 before the Bowmasters enters play. So takes out the Gilded Goose, which means that these Symmetry Sages are guaranteed to be getting in this turn. So definitely going to be using the Bowmasters or one of the creatures, sorry, to block the Soulscar Mage. Then the other thing you can do here potentially is Chord of Calling this turn, or potentially sacrifice the food here as well. So I think what Brian does here is an interesting play for sure. So he makes a food off the Gilded Goose, flashes in the Bowmasters, and then Chord of Callings for another Bowmasters here just to get a bunch of creatures in play, which I do like. This then enables him to potentially pick off the Soulscar Mage, right? The Wizards player is completely tapped out here, so there's nothing more instant speed that they can do. And Chord of Calling here for another Bowmasters allows you to take out the Soulscar Mage and still have stuff in play this turn. I think it's probably the best line, right? The only other potential line you have in this spot is trying to chord for Samwise and then hope to draw a familiar off the top. But with 3 lands, you have no way to cast them both in the same turn. So if Brian had another land here, I think there's potentially an argument for trying to go for Samwise and just spiking a Cauldron Familiar off the top. But since you don't have the 4th land, there's no way to chain that sequence together. So I think Brian definitely makes the best play here, gets another Bowmasters in play, takes out the Soulscar Mage, and they do draw a Familiar off the top. So had they drawn the 4th land, they could have potentially stolen this game out of nowhere. However, I think in this spot, you just have to cast the Woe Strider, hope the opponent is just completely out of gas, which is kind of unlikely considering they just drew 2 off the Flame of Anor, but that's your out in this scenario, right? So your best chance here is just cast the Woe Strider, pass, hope that you draw, Samwise off the top, potentially. Even then, you have the Confluence and you're at 1, so unlikely, kind of tough spot. If they had found that 4th land on curve, or the 3rd land on curve into a 4th land, then you do have the potential to steal this game. But like I said, against Wizards, game 1 is so rough because they're so good at keeping you off the combo. You have basically no interaction outside of Apparition and Yawgmoth, which is generally too slow unless you get off to a really fast start. So they do obviously have the Reckless Charge, so this is going to be lethal here. But this is kind of expected, right? You're on the draw against Wizards game 1. Very, very rare for you to pick up the dub in game 1 in this matchup. But post-sideboard, things do become a lot better, right? As I mentioned, the sideboard plan here against Wizards is you want the 4 Fatal Push and 3 Arrasta. And then, as I mentioned, the combo pieces are so bad in this matchup. I don't think we ever managed to combo off in testing in this matchup at all. So we also bring in the 2 Juggernaut Peddlers, which are 2 toughness creatures as well, but they get you value on ETB, and being able to potentially snipe a creature or an important piece of interaction with the Juggernaut Peddler is really, really important here as well. So what we do, board in the 4 Fatal Push, 3 Rasta, and the 2 Juggernaut Peddler, and then we cut 4 Woe Strider, 3 Samwise, and 2 Cauldron Familiar. So we cut the Woe Strider entirely because it's a 3-mana creature that trades down with all of their interaction. Now, you do get a 0/1, but that's so irrelevant in the most cases, right? At best, you use it to block a Soulscar Mage. Outside of that, all of their creatures have trample or flying, so the 0/1 basically does nothing. You never get to a point where you can really escape the Woe Strider either. Similarly, Samwise is just a 2-mana 2/2 that can die immediately to interaction. If it can survive, you start getting foods, which can be valuable, but the Wizards deck can outrace your ability to gain life so easily. I do like keeping in the single copy of Samwise, so you do still have the possibility to combo off chord if you have Yawgmoth and the Cauldron Familiar. And then similarly, trim 2 Cauldron Familiars. Now, Cauldron Familiar is probably the least worst out of the combo pieces, if that makes sense, because it does drain the opponent for 1, so it does buffer your life total slightly. And, it's unlikely to be a target for your opponent's removal unless they have like a Spikefield Hazard, because they want to save their removal for your other more impactful combo pieces. But again, I like trimming the Cauldron Familiars because they are pretty low impact in general. I like keeping in stuff like the Ropeline Attendant here because it enables the Knight Errant and also is difficult for them to interact with outside of Brotherhood's End. Now, Shinya has got Brotherhood's End in the sideboard, and with Open Decklist, we did prepare for this specific matchup. We expected him to bring in Aether Gusts, Unlicensed Hearse, and Brotherhood's End here, and he actually ended up bringing in we expected him to bring in Aether Gust, Unlicensed Hearse, and Brotherhood's End, and he didn't bring in the Aether Gust, which we were very happy to see afterwards, right? Aether Gust is very, very good against Arrasta specifically, and also Chord of Calling as well, which is another big card in the matchup as well, but him not bringing in the Aether Gust was a big advantage for us here. So I think in coverage, this did, they stayed on this for a while, so I'm just going to skip forward to when the match starts again. Okay, so back into things for game 2, and he gets 2 1-landers in a row, which is really rough. Having to go down to 5 against Wizards is not what you want to see, especially on the play. But this is a decent 5, right? This is probably as good a 5 as you can expect. You definitely want to keep the Overgrown Tomb and the confidence to be able to cast a Rasta, and you definitely need to put back the Knight Errant here. Your plan is Fatal Push to buy you time to get to a Rasta. That is the entire game plan with this hand, which is a pretty effective game plan against Wizards. I think Push and a Rasta are the two best cards in this matchup. Now, this is a matchup where you do want to mulligan a little bit more aggressively towards your high impact cards like Push and a Rasta. So, you do sometimes mulligan in this matchup post-sideboard in order to find these cards more consistently, but both of those mulligans were kind of forced, right? You can't keep one landers in this matchup because even if you have a number of mana dorks, Wizards is going to have a ton of interaction against you, particularly post-sideboard. They're probably likely to have more burn spells against you. They probably cut Reckless Charge for stuff like additional Reckless Rages and Strangles and stuff like that. So relying on mana dorks with one land hands is just too risky. So here, Chord of Calling is a fine pickup, but not particularly good with this hand, right? Because we don't have any creatures in play. Ideally, you just want to find the fourth land here, right? You just need to find a way to get a Rasta in play. Fatal Push should be pretty good at just buying you time to get to a Rasta, but yeah, finding the fourth land is the key here. Just getting a Rasta into play is step one to beating Wizards, because it is a big roadblock for them unless they immediately have Flame of Anor. So opponent plays Hersons is tapped out. You just have to push here before damage. You don't want to take unnecessary damage, and you want to take out their creatures as often as possible. Killing creatures against Wizards is so important because if you run them out of creatures, they just have to spin their wheels and they're not applying pressure, which buys you an enormous amount of time. So Gilded Goose is a pretty reasonable draw here, but again, you'd much prefer to find the fourth land, right? I think it's very likely that the Wizards player would have a burn spell at this point. Now, we can see from the opponent's hand, they do have multiple removal spells, but they're kind of forced into using the sleight of hand to try and find a land, and if they don't find an untapped red source here, they can't actually kill the goose, which is really huge. So this was quite a fortunate sequence of events for Brian here that the Gilded Goose survives. Again, there's a good chance that you draw the fourth land off the top here, but the goose surviving to guarantee the Arasta this turn is huge. And we didn't draw the fourth land, so that was really huge. You slam Arasta here for sure. Definitely the best card in the matchup. And Wizards cannot deal with this cleanly outside of Flame of Anor. Now, that Brotherhood's End in the Wizards' hand is pretty tricky here, because one way that you can cleanly deal with Arasta is set up a sequence where you go Burn Spell plus Brotherhood's End in order to deal with Arasta and all of the spider tokens at the same time, but the Wizards player obviously doesn't have that set up yet, and if they're forced to start spinning their wheels and they can't cleanly kill Arasta, this is where Arasta really starts to come into its own, particularly with this Chord of Calling now, right? Like I said, Chord of Calling isn't that great until you have stuff in play, but now we have Arasta in play and the Wizards player is starting to cast spells. We get a bunch of spider tokens in play, which then potentially allow you to chord. The ideal target here would be Yawgmoth, right? Yawgmoth you might not think is that good in the Wizards matchup because you have to lose life, but having 4 toughness is really huge, and it works so well with the Rasta. Once you start producing a bunch of tokens, that's really good fodder. You can then pick off their creatures. You can put a -1/-1 counter on the Dreadhorde Arcanist so that they can't use it from the graveyard unless they have a way to buff it, like Balmor or Symmetry Sage. So this is looking like a really good spot so far for Brian, right? Getting the Arasta down, and this is on a Multi 5 as well, so this just shows the power of stuff like Arasta in this matchup. Now, drawing a tapped land here is a little bit rough, right? If it had been an untapped land, you could just cleanly chord for the Yawgmoth here. However, I'm pretty confident that the Wizard player is going to be casting a spell during the next turn, so with this hand, I think the players just cast the Blooming Marsh, pass back. They probably are forced to play some sort of spell during their turn, to either try and deal with Arasta or, try and clear the way for the Arcanist or something. And then when they do that, you can then chord for Yawgmoth to then put a -1/- counter on the Arcanist to cut it off. Ideally, you want to be killing the Arcanist here, to be honest, because Wizards does have multiple ways to buff it, so even if you make it into a 0/2, they can buff it with the Symmetry Sage, they can buff it with the Balmor, but either way, I really like this position for Brian at this spot, and this just shows that Arasta can really solo it. Now again, Arasta can be a little bit rough if the opponent immediately has a Flame of Anor, but they have to have that straight away for it, and you still get a token out of the deal as well, so Wizards player plays the iteration here, which now you have the 4th token, so you can immediately chord for the Yawgmoth here, which is a really great sign. Wizards player does find the Flame of Anor, so they do now have an answer to the Arasta here, but potentially getting a Yawgmoth in play here is really huge because it just enables you to draw more, find more potential answers, find more potential Fatal Pushes, find more potential Arastas. Even finding Juggernaut Peddler would be nice here to get rid of that Symmetry Sage or the Brotherhood's End as well. Now, another fortunate thing for Brian here is that the Wizards player having to play that pathway on red in the early game and use Spikefield Hazard as a land means they only have 1 blue mana in play, which is really limiting their ability to develop here, which is pretty huge. So Goes to the end step. I like waiting till the end step there because you're pretty happy for Arcanist to attack here. You know, it will trigger the Arasta. You can cleanly block it as well. So I like waiting. You know, you could potentially go for your pre-combat in order to preemptively hit the Arcanist, but you're actually pretty happy for the Arcanist to attack here. And now I feel like, you know, Brian's in a really solid position. Unless the Wizards player immediately has Reckless Rage, which they happen to do here, then you're in a really good spot. Even with this Reckless Rage, you can still cleanly kill the Arcanist. Now, the way Reckless Rage works is it's not a fight spell, so even if you kill the Soulskull Mage, the Yawgmoth will be taking the damage. So I think the priority here is to kill the Arcanist. Again, you could just use one of the spiders to just put 1/1/1 counter on it, but like I feel in this spot it's kind of a turning point in the game. You really want to maximize the utility of Yawgmoth while you have it in play, and getting to draw 3 here is pretty huge. Now there is definitely a consideration between whether you want to potentially sack the Goose here or sack the Spider token. I think Brian goes for the Spider token here, which does then take you 3 damage, but I quite like this play. I think it's completely fine to keep the Goose around as well, because it's a really nice mana sink to be able to produce foods to gain you the 3 life back that you're losing off the Soulskull Mage. I do think it's close though. I could definitely see an argument to sacking the Goose and then just chump blocking with the Spider to preserve damage, but again, I think the Goose going forward in this game is going to be more valuable. And, you know, the priority for Shinya at this point is to try and take out the Arasta. They can't really afford to be using burn spells on the Gilded Goose here. So I think I like that play for sure. And then we have all 3 Arastas and the Fatal Push. So very, very solid draws for Brian here. Even if Shinya uses this Flame of Anor in order to take out the Arasta, they have the 2 backups here as well, which is really solid. I also like attacking here with the Arasta, right? Wizards can potentially fight through Arasta, specifically with Balmor. If they can get Balmor in play alongside other creatures, they can chain together a bunch of spells, give everything trample, and then fight through the Arasta. So I really like Brian's play of getting aggressive here. You do need to start closing the game out to give Wizards less opportunities, specifically with Brotherhood's End post-sideboard as well. Like I said, burn spell into Brotherhood's End is another way that they can just completely reset your board. And, you know, for the Soulskull Mage to attack here, they have to use a spell to buff its power, which triggers the Arasta, which gets blockers in play. So attacking with the Arasta, whilst it might not look like a good idea immediately, is definitely the way to go here. So now they do go, Shinya does go for this play here that I was talking about, where you go burn spell into Brotherhood's End to reset the board. But this still works very nicely for Brian with what he has, right? They use the Brotherhood's End, which puts the Soulskull Mage down to, you know, dies to 1 damage, and Brian has the Bowmasters in hand here as well, so this is a really solid exchange for Brian. Well, I mean, obviously losing the board is obviously bad with the Brotherhood's End, but from this point onwards, I still like Brian's position. They can use the Bowmasters here to pick up the Soulskull Mage, and then just cleanly resolve this second Arasta here, which is going to be, you know, they do have another Flame of Anor in hand, but being choked on blue mana here is really awkward, because it might mean that they can only use one of the modes on Flame of Anor, which really isn't ideal. Then the Flame of Anor is a 2-for-1 in Brian's favor, because he gets the 1/2 token as well. Typically, Flame of Anor is favored for the Wizards player in this exchange because they can draw 2 and kill the Arasta. The other thing to be wary of in this spot though is the Unlicensed Hearse. That is ticking up, it is getting big, and that can potentially be a way to kind of stymie the Arasta's ability to develop to the board, but Fatal Push is an immediate answer to that if they do ever choose to crew it up. And again, you know, had Shinya drawn an untapped blue land here, I think this looks a lot different, because they can go Symmetry Sage into Flame of Anor to not only kill the Arasta but also draw 2. So drawing a tap land there is definitely a big advantage for Brian here. So here Brian draws another land, tap land, so it doesn't really affect the ability for Brian to develop. There is potentially an argument to try and hold back the 1/1 here in case the opponent has creature into Reckless Charge. But again, they have the Arasta in place, so if they do play the Reckless Charge, they're guaranteed another token. Even though Shinya does kill the Arasta here, they have another one in hand, so I like attacking with both. Again, you need to start closing the game out and not give Wizards enough time to draw out of this scenario, because they do have the tools to do it, right? You do need to start turning the corner once you do have this Arasta, stopping them getting in for damage. So the Hearse keeps ticking up. It is becoming quite a big creature now, so it does make attacking riskier, but this Fatal Push in hand is super clutch now. You really want to try it at this point in the game and save this Fatal Push to deal with the Hearse, because that's the only real big issue. You're at 12, you're not really too concerned about that sort of thing. Ropeline Attendant, not very good off the top in these sort of longer games, but it does give Bowmasters another creature when it enters play. So I like running it out pre-combat because there is a chance that you might want to run out Bowmasters here depending on what the opponent does. Kind of unlikely, but you're probably going to play it anyway, so it makes sense to do it pre-combat. And then you want to attack with everything. There's nothing here that Shinya can have that's really a problem because they only have blue mana. They only have access to red mana here, so it's only burn spells really. The worst case scenario is they use a burn spell on one of your creatures and then corrupt the hearse, but even then you're prepared with the Fatal Push. So here I really like not preemptively using the Fatal Push. You just basically want to hold it for that unlicensed hearse, which is the main issue here. Because if Shinya can block with the unlicensed hearse here, they do represent a big attack next turn, right? I mean, they don't know that we've got Bowmasters, but from Shinya's side, you could potentially corrupt the hearse to block, then draw a burn spell off the top to kill the Rapeline Attendant, corrupt the hearse again and attack for a big amount here. But either way, I think this is pretty favoured in Brian's favour. He has the Bowmasters as another blocker on the ground. He has the Fatal Push here to be able to kill the hearse when they presumably crew it up. So yeah, this game looks pretty locked up. Again, he had to go through all 3 Erastas, but this is why we're running the 3 in this sideboard. You know, in order to flip this matchup on its head post sideboard, you need the 3 Erastas, you need the 4 Fatal Pushes to really flip the matchup on its head. In earlier testing, we only had 2 Erastas, 1 Crawl Harpooner as a Chord of Calling target, but just Erasta, you wanted to draw it as consistently as possible. I don't think you can afford to run 4 though, because it is pretty clunky in multiples. It can be awkward in your opening hand, particularly if you draw it. You know, obviously in this matchup you want to draw it in multiples for sure, but like you're not always going to find your 4th land in a 21 land deck, and you know your mana dorks can get killed as well. Plus it is a pretty high investment running 3 of this sort of card in because it is mainly here for wizards, also good for Dimir, so you don't really want to be using up too many of your sideboard spots for specific matchups. But yeah, as you can see, the sideboard plan here: 4 push in, 3 Erasta in, 2 Peddler in. And I was kind of shocked looking at Shinya's sideboard that he wasn't bringing the Aethergust here. I think this is probably a scenario where he was looking at our main deck and not our sideboard necessarily. I think in general, I mean, if he'd known that we're really heavily trimming the combo, I think they would probably not board in the unlicensed hearse and use the Aethergust instead. But when I was playing with Shinya's deck in practice, in prep for this matchup, because we expected to face Shinya going into the second day of competition, so we were practicing the matchup beforehand, when I was using the deck, using 2 Brotherhood's End, 2 Hearse, 2 Aethergust. So very happy not to see the Aethergust brought in by Shinya. That's definitely a big advantage. And again, having to mulligan here is very, very rough. You know, Brian did not get very lucky with his opening 7s, but this 6 is pretty reasonable, right? You've got Apparition to kind of slow the opponent down and the Erasta here. And I definitely like putting the land back here, right? You do obviously need the 4th land for Erasta, but you have... You know, you're on the draw, you have a bunch of draw steps to try and find the 4th land, and Brian immediately finds it here as well. So very happy with the mulligan decisions here. You know, very happy with the putback as well. Cauldron Familiar obviously can't block, so not a very big roadblock, but the 1 life is relevant somewhat, and it does enable the Convoke cards here, so not the worst turn 1 play. This Fatal Push off the top was huge here though, right? Because Apparition on 3 is kind of a roadblock, but slowing the Wizards player down even further is absolutely huge here. So I think I like preemptively firing off the Fatal Push on the Arcanist here. You know, you might as well wait. You could very well wait until the opponent's turn, but they do have Spell Pierce in the sideboard. I'd be super surprised if Shinya did bring it in, but I think there's virtually no downside to doing it main phase there, so might as well fire it off. Now, Shinya does find more creatures, and the creature-heavy hands are, from my experience, the most difficult for the Sam deck to deal with. But having said that, with a Rasta, you know, it's kind of actually good in a way for them to find more creatures. I think if you don't have a Rasta, the creature heavy hands are very difficult to beat because you're more reliant on Fatal Push and Apparition. If you do have a Rasta, then I think, you know, as long as they don't have Flame of Anor, you're in a pretty good spot here. So Shinya's deciding between what he wants to keep and what he doesn't here. With a lot of lands in hand, I definitely like his play of, you know, prioritizing the creatures here, and I like getting Soulscar Mage in first. Keep the Symmetry Sage as hidden information, because you can then play the Symmetry Sage and then use it to immediately buff the Soulscar Mage. Also, if Brian has removal, which he does here, I think he would rather lose one of the 2 Soulscar Mages than the Symmetry Sage. I definitely like this play here, though. You know, again, there are better things for the Apparition to answer. I think, in particular, Balmor and Arcanist are the 2 things you want to prioritize the most. Taking out with the Apparition. Again, Hearse isn't really much of an issue for us at all. Obviously, it can become a big blocker later in the game, but in terms of shutting off the combo, we barely have the combo in, right? We shift to basically a mid-range deck that will once every 100 games be able to assemble the combo post-sideboard. So Hearst isn't really much of an issue until the late game, and, you know, we're happy for the game to go long against Wizards as long as we can buy the time to get there. But as I mentioned, you know, Apparition does have better targets, but you just want to slow the Wizards deck down to a point where Arasta can stabilize you. Drawing the second Arasta here is obviously, you know, great. This is basically the game plan in action, though, right? This whole matchup post sideboard is you want to draw your Arastas and Fatal Pushes, which is why we're running it in very high numbers. And obviously, you know, quite fortunate to find 5 of the best sideboard card in the matchup, but this is the reason why we're running it in such high numbers, because the way you win this matchup post sideboard is by, you know, mulliganing slightly aggressively to your Fatal Pushes and your Arastas. So getting the Arasta down here, very, very strong. Shinya's out of spells already. I mean, obviously Brian doesn't know that, but I do like this position. Now, obviously having a lot of creatures is good, but it's scary because the Wizards player, as I mentioned, one of the ways they can fight through Arasta is getting Balmor down and then just chaining a bunch of spells together to give everything to give everything trample. And then the 1/2s don't really do enough at all, right? If you give your whole board, you know, +3, +0, and trample, those 1/2 tokens off Arasta is really tricky. Fatal Push here is a really solid draw, but the awkward thing here for Brian is, with all these creatures in play, you don't have a way to apply pressure and start turning the game like he did last game, right? Last game, kind of a creature light draw from Shinya, and he was able to start turning the game and start attacking to close the game out. Now here in this spot, even though I definitely like Brian's position because we have the 2 Arastas and the Fatal Push, Bowmasters is also nice if they do find Flame of Anor, for example, but they don't have a good way to close the game out yet, which is a little bit awkward, but I definitely like Brian's position here. So Shinya finds an Inspiration off the top, which is a really solid draw for him for sure. That can hopefully help him find something like a Flame of Anor from his side. Finds the Wizard's Lightning and the Otawara, which ends up being quite important in this game because that is a potential clean, if you want to call it that, answer to Arasta, even though it is pretty expensive, right? And I really like this play from Shinya. You want that Otawara in hand to be able to answer the Arasta. And then he holds onto the Wizard's Lightning and does attack in with everything here, but, well, outside of the 1/1 here, but like, this is going to represent a really solid exchange for Brian here because he can use the Bowmasters to take out the 1/1 pretty cleanly here, and then use the 1/1 token from the Bowmasters in order to block the Soulscar Mage. Presumably, Shinya's trying to set up to use Soulscar Mage's passive ability on the Arasta to try and shrink it so that Symmetry Sage can cleanly kill it. This is another way that the Wizards player can, you know, put themselves in a position where Arasta doesn't trade too well with stuff, because the other key thing with Arasta is it has 3 power, right? So even if you do use it to block and it dies to a burn spell, it still trades with the creature, right? So you're still up, you know, 2 for 1, oftentimes 3 for 1 in some situations, but in this spot, since Soulscar Mage's ability would shrink the Arasta, that's a way that the creature can survive in combat. So I really like Brian's play here of using the Fatal Push on the Soulscar Mage. Obviously, you could use the Fatal Push on the other Symmetry Sage to kill it instead, but this way, you get to keep the 1/1 token around. You still get to cleanly trade in combat with the Symmetry Sage. You do take 3, and they do get to keep another Symmetry Sage, but I kind of like that exchange because, as I mentioned, I think that ability for Soulscar Mage to shrink the Arasta in combat is very relevant. So just getting it off the board so more burn spells off the top aren't super relevant is really good. And now they've got multiple tokens into play, this is a good spot for Brian. Now again, this is kind of a risky attack from Brian now that we know they have Otawara, because Otawara into exactly Wizard's Lightning off the top can potentially win Shinya the game here because he can crew the Hearst. However, I think Brian's play is correct here, you know. Obviously, we know that the opponent has the Otawara, but by not attacking with everything, you make yourself much more vulnerable to Brotherhood's End. And considering Brotherhood's End is a 2 of, I think it's best to play around that rather than the 1 of Otawara. Again, it's close. I think there's definitely an argument to keeping the 1/1 back, but I definitely think in situations like this, it's so hard to play around the 1 of Otawara, right? And if you don't attack, like I said, it makes Brotherhood's End a lot better against your board position as well. You know, I'm not sure if it would change the clock necessarily, right? Because Shinya's still at 8. So I think on balance, it may have been better here to just hold back one of these tokens here. Probably the 1/2 reach blocker, you know, the spider here. But I don't fault Brian at all for making this attack because I think here he's considering more Brotherhood's End and Otawara. And as I said, playing around the 1 of is really tricky to do. So here, same sort of position as before. Shinya still has this Otawara. Presumably, he's going to use it during the end step to try and bounce the Arasta here in order to try and then clear the way for a top deck. They also have the Fiery Islet to get 2 draw spells to try and find something here. So again, there is maybe an argument to holding back the 1/2, but like I said, it's whether you play around Otawara versus whether you play around Brotherhood's End, and I think as a 2 of versus a 1 of, I still like Brian's play here. You want to start closing these game out and not give Wizards more time to top deck. There is potentially an argument to holding on to the Samwise if you are thinking about Brotherhood's End, but I like playing it out here because it shuts off the possibility of the Hearst attacking, right? If Shinya is going to be bouncing the Arasta here, and then playing the Samwise means that Wizards Lightning is no longer a good out here, right? Because previously they could Wizards Lightning face, crew up the Hearst, and then attack. If they Wizards Lightning face here and crew up the Hearst, the Samwise can block it. So even though playing the Samwise out here does make the board more vulnerable to Brotherhood's End, I think it's a very important card to play out so that the Wizards Lightning into crew Hearst line isn't really that viable anymore, if that makes sense. So I think at this point, the only real out to Shinya is I don't even know, iteration into Balmor into Burn Spell or something like this. They'd have to hit basically perfectly. Now, they do find a Sokenzan, which is another card that I wasn't thinking about when I was watching this match initially, but Sokenzan is another card that incentivizes you to make slightly more aggressive attacks, because now, even with Sokenzan, the board is just too wide to be able to block everything, right? So even though, Shinya did have Otawara, I still like Brian's slightly more aggressive attacks, because not only does it play around Brotherhood's End, but it also plays around Sokenzan as well, which is pretty nice. So then Chord of Calling, I don't think that's really going to end up mattering here. I think you just probably go for an all-out attack here. Again, they can channel in the Sokenzan, but the board is just too wide at this point, right? They can channel the Sokenzan, they only have 3 blockers. Brian has 6 attackers here, so if they had held back slightly earlier to play around the Otawara for that 1 turn, they wouldn't have necessarily had lethal this turn and would have bought Shinya another draw step. So again, closing games out is really important, but you do obviously want to be considering stuff like Brotherhood's End. Again, Otawara, I feel like with those sorts of cards, you can only really afford to play around it if you're super, super far ahead, and you can literally afford to play around everything. And yeah, Brian manages to pull out the game, which is a huge dub in this matchup. Okay, so next up we've got the matchup against Dimir Control against Basil Nasri, who ended up 2nd place in the tournament overall. So played the deck really well throughout the weekend. This matchup is very close game 1. I think probably more favoured towards the Dimir player, but post-sideboard, when we have access to the Elven Chorus, the Arastas, and the Juggernaut Peddlers, I feel like it definitely becomes a bit more in our favour. But overall, it is a generally close matchup overall here, I think. Being on the draw is a little bit rough, but I think this keep looks pretty good, right? We've got Cauldron Familiar on turn 1, into Ropeline on turn 2, which is really solid, especially if the Dimir Control player doesn't have a sweeper, right? Ropeline Attendant on its own is very, very solid against the single target removal in the opponent's deck. And I do like this opening play here, right? Brian chooses to not play the Cauldron Familiar out on turn 1 to give them a target for Fatal Push, for example, but it also means that it gets the bonus from Ropeline Attendant, which not only means that it puts an extra token in play when it comes into play, but if you bring Familiar back from the graveyard at any point in the game, with food off Gilded Goose or Samwise Gamgee, then Cauldron Familiar also re-enters and makes another token here. So interesting attack from Basil. This is very obviously representing an Orcish Bowmasters here. So blocking here basically forces the Bowmasters out, right? Forces them to flash down the second one. Now, I'm not sure I love blocking the Amass token here. I think I would personally have blocked the Orcish Bowmasters myself, but I think that's a very, very small difference, and I think the block there makes a lot of sense as well. So getting Samwise out while the Dimir Control player is tapped out is really big. Another reason why I like the block here is because it forces the Dimir Control player to tap out, which enables Brian to get the Samwise Gamgee out uncontested here. Then a tap land for Basil is pretty brutal. It means he hasn't got any counter spells online here, and this is a really interesting turn for Brian here. So he's got Chord of Calling, so we've got the combo available, right? You can chord for 3 for Woe Strider, you can chord for 4 for Yawgmoth, and so I think the risk here with going for the main phase chord is obviously if Basil has changed the equation or a make disappear, then that can obviously counter it, but I think while the opponent doesn't have access to 3 mana for Archmage's Charm, your chances of resolving this chord and comboing off aren't going to get any higher throughout the match, right? Because the Dimir Control deck always plays at instant speed. So I really like the play that Brian goes for here. Chords for 4. I mean, 3 or 4 doesn't really make a difference. If he had 1 extra mana, then I think calling for 3 would be the better play, because then if the opponent had Make Disappear, they would be forced to use the casualty to sacrifice one of their creatures to counter it, but gets the Waste Rider in play, and then luckily, Basil just doesn't have any way to stop the combo, so you just managed to get the combo here. As I said, you just sacrifice the Familiar, bring it back, makes another one with Samwise, so managed to steal game 1, which is pretty huge. But that does happen, we tested the Dimir matchup a lot, and even though the deck is strong and does have the tools to fight you, especially game 1, there are just some hands where the opponent has to keep counter spells and you manage to get creatures underneath them, or they just don't have the early interaction, particularly if they keep a hand off the back of Bowmasters, which doesn't really do too much against us. Then they don't really have good ways to stop us. Now, sideboarding against Dimir is another matchup where we like to trim on the combo, so we bring in 2 Juggernaut Peddler, which is really good as sort of a Thoughtseize style effect. 3 Elven Chorus is absolutely fantastic in this matchup, because if you can get that underneath a counterspell at any point, the only answer the Dimir control deck has is commit to memory. So once the Elven Chorus is in play, you are the huge favourite. You can just play off the top of your library. The Dimir control deck has no way to answer it outside of that one of. And then we've also got 3 copies of Arasta here as well. Now, because we're bringing in a lot of 4-drops, we do have to trim on the Knight Errants, because we have a lot more expensive cards. We're not very, we're not going to be able to convoke the Knight Errant out as consistently, really. And we also just trim Might and 1 of each of the combo pieces. So, like the keep here for Brian for sure, especially against the potential Thoughtseize deck. And this hand looks really strong here. We've got Chorus, Arasta, Bowmasters, and a piece of ramp here as well. Now, from Brian's side, if you see the Thoughtseize and the opponent takes the Elven Chorus here, you have to imagine they have a removal spell for the Halfling. I think if they didn't have a removal spell for the Halfling, they would probably have to take that, because otherwise, not only does Halfling represent ramping into Chorus or Arasta, but it also represents making Arasta uncounterable, which is pretty huge. So they use the Legion's End, which makes sense. They did have the removal spell, but it does tap them out during their turn, which is pretty relevant, I think. So Brian gets to resolve a Samwise here, and now is where things get a little bit more spicy, because obviously the Dimir player is representing a ton of different potential interaction here, and so now it just becomes a game about, from Brian's perspective, just trying to play around all the possible things that Basil could have. So main phasing the Archmage's Charm makes a lot of sense in this spot, because Basil knows that Brian has the Bowmasters here, right? So if they wait and they want to draw, they have to do it main phase. But I think that's a decent sign for Brian, because it shows that they don't have what they need in their hand, and they're having to dig towards it. They don't really have a good way to punish it, though. They don't have a proactive 3-drop that they can sneak under the counter spell. With 2 Bowmasters in hand, the obvious play here is to play a tap land and then flash in Bowmasters at the end of the opponent's turn. But Bowmasters is really solid in this matchup, because it is really difficult for the Dimir player to interact with favourably, right? If they try and counter it during the opponent's end step, then that's less mana that they have during your turn to use on counter spells and interaction and stuff. It also taxes their draw effects, like Archmage's Charm. Now, typically, the Dimir deck doesn't run that many draw effects, so that Bowmasters isn't that relevant compared to the 1 ring variants, which didn't see any play this weekend, which I was also kind of surprised about, but it's still very effective purely because it's a flash threat. Now, here's an interesting choice, with what we know about about Basil's hand. I think in a vacuum, the Arasta would be the best play, but obviously Brian doesn't know what's in their hand, and just casting Arasta out into a potential counterspell is very risky, particularly when they have Bowmasters as another good viable plan here. So I think in Brian's seat, without the information that we have, using Bowmasters here is just much better, because Basil is already down to 7, and if you flash in the Bowmasters, it applies so much pressure they have to tap out for a sweeper, which then enables you to go for Arasta when they're tapped out. So here we've got Sauron's Ransom. I like this split quite a lot, I feel like you almost always want to go for 2 and 2 here, really. And if you put a Snapcaster Mage face up, the opponent is almost always going to pick the Snapcaster Mage, so I like putting it face down. So here Basil picks the face down pile with the Snapcaster Mage in, which is definitely the best pick. It was, but I do like this split here, right? I think Change the Equation and Passage are the better lands of the 2, because Fable Passage does then enable Revolt on Fatal Push, which is pretty big. And now in this spot, interesting whether Basil wants to go for the Languish here or not. I think if he doesn't, he's under a lot of pressure from the Bowmasters. I mean, having said that, they do have a counterspell in the graveyard, so even if Brian does flash in Bowmasters, which is pretty telegraphed heavy here, right? I think Basil has to know that Brian has a Bowmasters here. I guess he could have 2 lands in hand, but I don't think if Brian had Chord of Calling, which is the only other instant speed thing that Basil needs to worry about, he would have definitely left the 1/1 untapped and been able to Chord of Calling for Juggernaut Peddler. So I think from this position, Basil has to think that Brian either has nothing, which is great, or has Bowmasters, and he chooses to wait a turn on the Languish, which I think is definitely defensible. So there's the Bowmasters, which I think Basil must have anticipated at this point, and he goes for the Snapcaster Mage into Change the Equation, which does tap Basil out here, but it does mean, or maybe not change the equation, he might have gone for Archmage's Charm here, but either way, I think he chooses to counter the Bowmasters because he's just under too much pressure otherwise, which then is a little bit awkward for Basil because, you know, he is tapped out, which means that the way is clear for the Arasta to resolve through a counterspell now, and the only sweeper that Brian has in hand the only sweeper that Basil has in hand here is Languish, which the Arasta survives. You know, this is one of the main reasons why we really liked Arasta in this matchup, because Languish seemed like the most common sweeper from the Dimir side, and Arasta survives it. Now, here's a really interesting choice for Brian. You could obviously just slam the Arasta here, but Bowmasters can kill the Snapcaster Mage and represent a ton of damage. And obviously, Brian doesn't know what's in Basil's hand, so I think he's probably thinking the way that Basil's been playing, he must have a sweeper because he's been very slow to react to my creatures on board. And if that sweeper's Languish, then that is a bit annoying, but he gets to get in for 5 damage here, put Basil down to 2. If the sweeper's Languish, he can follow up with Arasta. If the sweeper is Extinction Event, then playing Arasta here is a lot worse. So from the information that Brian had, I really like the play of just going for Bowmasters because, you know, if they have Extinction Event, you can play the Arasta, and then it's really difficult for the Dimir deck to answer your board at that point. And if they have Languish, which Basil does here, you still get to cast Arasta while the shields are down next turn. So Basil gets the Stone of Urek in play before the Languish goes off, presumably to exile the Samwise so that he can't get it back from the graveyard later in the game, and also because of Woestrider, right? Woestrider wants a lot of cards in the graveyard to be able to bring back, so using the Stone of Urek to cut the cards out of the graveyard slows down Brian's ability to escape Woestrider if that comes up later in the game. Now that Basil's shield's down, Brian gets to resolve the Arasta, which looks really good in this spot. There's no removal spell in Basil's graveyard that can answer it immediately, which is really big in this particular situation. So Basil's in a tough spot now, but he does still have access to Lurrus, which is a really good way that he could potentially get back in the game, especially off the lifelink. So interesting choice here that Basil's got. He can potentially Sauron's Ransom, he can potentially use Snapcaster Mage as a chump blocker, or he could potentially put Lurrus into hand and cast it as a lifelinker. I'm not sure Lurrus is that great in this spot because you really want to use Lurrus the same turn. If you do play Lurrus, you're forced to chump block it and then you just lose it immediately. So I think I like Basil's play here of just passing, potentially using Snapcaster Mage as a chump blocker, potentially trying to find a removal spell off the Sauron's Ransom. So Brian draws a Gilded Goose here, and I think, you know, first order of this turn is definitely just to attack first, right? You have lethal in play. Presumably Basil has to have something here because they didn't just play the Lurrus. And Basil leads on the Sauron's Ransom, which I think is a good play because you want to find a removal spell. And this is a really interesting choice here because I think in Basil's seat, you know, you're forced to take anything that isn't a removal spell. So if there's not a removal spell in the face-up pile, you're forced to do the face-down pile. So I could see a spot here where you go 3-1 potentially. In testing, I said to Brian that with Sauron's Ransom, it's usually not a good idea to get too cute with that. Just play it safe in the most part. So I do like the split here. The only difference I would make is I would definitely have put the Darkslick Shores in the alternate pile because Basil is very, very heavily incentivized to take the face-down pile to try and find a removal spell. And if you give them Darkslick Shores instead of Island, that's a tap land rather than an untap land, which can make a difference. The big thing here, though, is that Drown in the Loch isn't a removal spell. Basil playing the Stone of Urek earlier before the Languish means that Brian doesn't have enough creatures in his graveyard for Drown in the Loch to kill Arasta, that makes such a big difference in this spot. So again, I can't fault Basil for this play because I believe he was only running 1 Drown in the Loch in the deck. So you don't really want to be accounting for that with the Stone of Urek play. But this kind of sucks for Basil because now this Drown in the Loch isn't really doing all that much. Now, Brian chooses not to play the Ropeline Attendant here, which is probably trying to play around a sweeper or something like that. I kind of feel like the only sweeper you really get punished for here is Extinction Event, which again, you could have been, you know, Brian could have been playing around Extinction Event here. I think it's pretty close. I could see an argument to just running out the Ropeline Attendant just to try and ensure that you have lethal the following turn, right? The only thing you get punished by there is Extinction Event, and I feel with Lurrus still available, Extinction Event you probably can't afford to beat in this spot. Now, this is an interesting spot. Basil tries to get Lurrus online, and now the untapped land off the Sauron's Ransom does make a difference. So had Brian given him the the Darkslick Shores, Basil would have been unable to cast the Snapcaster Mage this turn. But thankfully, Brian draws the Yawgmoth here, which is a clean answer to the Lurrus, and now it's going to be almost impossible for Basil to win because Brian can kill the Lurrus, which removes the lifelink, forcing him to chump block with the Snapcaster Mage. Also draws 2, which is obviously very, very good against the control deck. So that Yawgmoth top deck was pretty important here, I think. But, I feel like Brian's still got a good shot without it. These small things like the pile with the Sauron's Ransom could have made a difference. Basil playing the Stone of Erech early could have made a difference. So really, really interesting game here for sure. And Basil doesn't really have a good way to do this. He can play the Languish, which kills the Yawgmoth, but, this is the main reason we have a Raster in the deck, because it survives Languish, and Brian managed to pick up the win, so that was a really big win for Brian there, for sure. So that does it for this video. Just want to say a big congrats and thanks to Brian for hopping on this video. It was really, really fun to work with him on the deck, and he played the deck so tightly over the weekend, so big congrats to him. I'm going to leave a link to this down in the description, the deck list and everything. As I said, I am going to swap out the Remorseful Cleric for Juggernaut Peddler because I do think that is a good swap going forwards. And overall, I think this deck is really solid at the moment. I mean, having said that, if Wizards starts to take over the ladder again because Shinya Saito won the tournament, and big shouts out to Shinya as well. He played out of his mind over this weekend. Really, really solid player. Then maybe this isn't the best positioned deck because even though we have a sideboard plan against Wizards, it's still one of the trickier matchups. But assuming that the metagame is still pretty diverse, I think this deck is a really solid choice, and I'm really happy with how it came together. Again, if you like this sort of video, definitely let me know in the comments, and I'll try and do it in future if I do more prep for this, for tournaments like this in future. And I hope you enjoy the video. I'll catch you in the next one. Big up.